Okay, so I think we're going to get started, and Spencer will continue to let people who pre-registered into the room as they come in. Just please keep yourself muted while we run through the interview with Cary, and then we'll be able to open it up to comments and Q&A. Do put comments and questions in the chat, and Spencer and I will be scrolling through the chat, and we'll call on you. You'll be able to unmute yourself. This is later in the Q&A. So that'll be the best way, I think, to proceed. We're going to officially close at about 1, but Cary has agreed to stay on. People want to continue to have a conversation and discussion. So we'll keep the Zoom call open a little while longer after 1. And also, I just wanted to alert you all to a survey that we'll be sending out on this webinar on Monday or Tuesday, which will be important for you to fill out, because that's how we'll get your mailing address so that we can actually give you a copy of this phenomenal research paper and study that Cary's going to talk about today, that AAN has published and is being distributed by Academic Studies Press, and we're really proud. It's really a terrific volume, and it's our inaugural paper in AAN's research paper series. So you should have received an email, our monthly newsletter, that has some information about our research paper series, because we'd love to get further proposals. We have a couple papers in the hopper. We'd love to be able to produce your work. So if that's of interest, please consider submitting a short proposal that we can consider. So today we're going to talk about Not in Kansas Anymore, Academic Freedom in Palestinian Universities, that Cary Nelson has authored. Cary, many of you know already, but he is the Jubilee Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Professor of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's also an affiliated professor at University of Haifa. He received an honorary doctorate from Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And he was, many of you know, the national president of the American Association of University Professors. And he's the current chair of the Alliance for Academic Freedom, which is an organization that AAN often collaborates with. Cary is the author or editor of over 30 books and hundreds and hundreds of essays and reviews. And some of you know the work that he's done already for AAN. Last year, Israel Denial came out, and you can just see it's like our Bible, because I have it annotated. I read it all the time and reference it. It's excellent. If you haven't, read this yet, co-published by Academic Engagement Network and Indiana University Press. And then at one of the earliest AAN national conferences, which we will do again when we can get together next year, hopefully, Cary gave a talk, and that became one of our pamphlets, one of our first pamphlets on conspiracy pedagogy, which is free up on our website. We know students use that a lot, and also faculty, and I've shared it. I put it in people's mailboxes, like, hey, here's a little gift for you, and people find it helpful. So what we're going to do today is talk about NICA, Not in Kansas Anymore, and Cary will give us some insight about this research and the study that he did, and we'll proceed with some back and forth questions. So in an interview style. And Cary and I prepared the questions together, and we think this will give you a good sense of the project. So first off, Cary, I have to ask you, why did you choose Not in Kansas Anymore as the main title of this research project? And what is that supposed to convey to readers?
So I should start by thanking you, Miriam, for actually suggesting that I do this project. I don't think you thought it would end up being 50,000 words when you suggested it, but you decided, in for a penny, in for a pound. And I also want to thank AEN staff for being really devoting serious time and intellectual energy to the project. Rafa gave me incredible feedback. Spencer did very careful copy editing. Um, Once I've worked through one of my pieces for a couple of dozen times, I really can't see anything anymore. So without copy editing, I'm really kind of up the creek. Thanks to all of you for showing up. I realize that in any given day, you have 70 to 80 different Zoom opportunities. And so you have to select between them. So in response to the first question, I think at a kind of broad level, people tend to assume if they're in the United States or Europe, that the principle of academic freedom, the principle that really underlies higher education and governs its educational functions, means the same thing from one country to another. Academic freedom is the right of faculty members to express their ideas freely, publish accordingly without fear of retribution, and student academic freedom gives them the right to express their views freely and study fields of their choosing. A number of countries and educational institutions claim to honor the principle of academic freedom, and in some cases, this is true. But regarding the two most sensitive subjects, religion and politics, academic freedom is often claimed disingenuously. They say they honor it, but they don't. In a number of Palestinian institutions, which is the subject of this project, academic freedom really doesn't exist at all on those key terrains. The title, Not in Kansas Anymore, of course, is borrowed from Dorothy's famous remark in The Wizard of Oz to her dog Toto, that, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. And it's intended to highlight that difference between how we think about how we think about higher education and how we think about academic freedom in different international contexts. And it's also, it's a playful title, but a serious one as well, and designed to signal the shock that sort of follows upon recognizing the difference. To put it in what is a completely realistic way, unfortunately, joining a Hamas terror cell is not quite the same as joining a chapter of college Democrats or even college Republicans on an American campus. We tend to assume that higher education institutions worldwide that carry the name college or university, that they're all roughly similar, even more broadly than just the concept of academic freedom. And it's roughly true that an accounting or an engineering course in one country will pretty much resemble courses in the same subject elsewhere. But a religion course in a theocracy that imposes a state religion on its people will be different from a course of the same name in countries where religion and democratic freedoms prevail. Similarly, of course, on government or politics, in a dictatorship will not resemble comparably named courses elsewhere. Cultural and political differences have instructional and pedagogical consequences. Where the differences are substantial, as they are in the West Bank and Gaza, they can produce different models of what constitutes higher education. And if you simply think about those enterprises on the assumption that you're still more or less in Kansas, ideologically, you're going to miss the boat. So, Not in Kansas Anymore, it consists of 13 separate chapters detailing evidence about the West Bank and Gaza. And the chapters include, for example, student political factions recently at war, the assaults on normalizers and collaborators, freedom of the press and academic freedom, terrorism at An-Najah University, and anti-Zionist and Islamist curricula. Just to pick one example, freedom of the press and academic freedom, we don't tend to think substantively about the relationship between those two kinds of freedoms. That is, but actually, if you don't have freedom of the press, you aren't going to have academic freedom. So those are integrally related in nation states where freedom of the press is compromised. And that's why that really required a separate chapter on that topic to give people some understanding of how that dynamic functions when both kinds of freedom are compromised. One of the things I do in addition is detail the history of Palestinian higher education, about which very few people know very much. It's important to remember that there were no Palestinian universities prior to the 1967 war. Egypt neither encouraged nor permitted their development during the years when it occupied Gaza, nor did Jordan do so when it occupied the West Bank. It's Israel that granted the permission for Palestinian universities to be formed early in the 1970s. Thus, Palestinian higher education was founded and evolved during a period in which Palestinians were developing a sense of national identity and acquiring political aspirations. I don't think it's either surprising or objectionable that emerging educational institutions played a role in articulating Palestinian national identity and its component aspirations. I think that's something you would expect higher education to do. What really no one could have anticipated was the role that higher education played during the first Intifada. The only real book on that is Ido Zelkowicz's Students and Resistance in Palestine, which is a very good guide, both to that period, also to the developments in the 1950s. In any case, Palestinian universities became organizing centers both for the political arguments fueling the Intifada and for off-campus demonstrations. That is, off-campus demonstrations were organized on campus. Not all of them, but a significant number. Israel was terrified of a general insurrection, something much broader and more violent even than the first Intifada was. And as a response, it repeatedly closed campuses down, which was not a good decision. It freed up people to be out on the streets. I mean, it was like totally counterproductive, bad idea. And actually, the Palestinian universities closed themselves down in response to student protests several times, though not for as long a period. Closing them down, in any case, did not curtail the growing definitional commitment to a higher education mission of political resistance. I think closing them down may have enhanced that sense of resistance being connected with higher education. Now, off-campus classes during the first Intifada were officially prohibited by Israel, though in practice, Israel tolerated them. So those classes held off campus, dramatized by the need to be off campus, inevitably became sites of political discussion and debate. You can see how these decisions kind of played off on one another and maximized the difficulty. Palestinian higher education consequently acquired an intense commitment to very hostile political action. When the second Intifada broke out, a number of students traded stones and Molotov cocktails for bombs. The pervasive politicization and really militarization of education that took place in Palestinian universities in the 1980s left a legacy that is still very much alive today. Now, the basic paradox about Palestinian higher education, and you need to understand that because it really is a paradox, is that the universities are perfectly capable of, say, preparing a student to be a competent accountant or a medical technician. Training in these and many other practical careers necessary to the functioning of Palestinian society apparently proceeds reliably. So Palestinian universities are doing that. They're training people to fulfill those functions in Palestinian society and doing a responsible, well, more or less responsible job of doing it. Um, Palestinian universities, however, have not yet evolved into full-fledged PhD granting institutions, but they have added a number of master's degree programs over the last generation. Their record of encouraging faculty research, long pretty much acknowledged to be weak, has also gradually improved.
So that was great, Cary. Really gave us a sense of what's in NICA, along with the sort of the general themes and arguments. And I kind of want to pick up on this point of Palestinian campuses being sites of violence and incitement to violence. And I want to just because of copyright issues, we didn't produce these on a PowerPoint, but there are 4 pages of colored slides in NICA, and you're all going to get this when we mail it out to you. But you know, it's really eye-opening when you realize this is on a campus. Terror cells and insignia and slogans and all sorts of murals and presentations for students to come in and glorify and kind of learn about terror. So that's really striking. So I thought, could you speak a little bit more to that aspect of the research and the evidence that you found?
Yeah, I suppose the place to begin is with a very telling anecdote. From 1978 to 1991, Cary Nelson taught philosophy at Birzeit University on the West Bank. It's on the outskirts of Ramallah. He'd studied at Oxford, received a doctorate in Islamic philosophy from Harvard. In September 1987, he was teaching philosophy. At the end of a lecture on John Locke, he learned that a group of masked men armed with clubs were waiting outside his classroom seeking a traitor. He learned shortly that that traitor was himself. The masked men kept his faculty colleagues at bay with knives, so they couldn't come in to help him. And they beat Neseba with fists, clubs, a broken bottle, and penknives. He realized that the intent was to kill him. He ran into an elevator thinking he could escape, pressed the buttons, the elevator wasn't working. He had enough adrenaline to hurl himself against the students, break through them, and escape. In his autobiographical book, Once Upon a Country, he writes, "My heart was pounding hard enough to pop my eardrums." His colleagues were now free to help him because he'd broken through the students. So they drove him to the hospital where they stitched up a wound in his forehead and set his arm, which was broken. Afterwards, only afterwards, not long afterwards, he learned that the attackers, the masked men, were all students at Birzeit. Worse still, that he knew several of them. Several of them were students he knew who wore masks to assault and try to kill him. The reaction of the university was indifferent. Reminds you of our own administrators. It only issued a general statement condemning campus violence and in no way referring to anything that happened to him. The faculty union, which he'd been a founder of, refused to support him. Fatah, the organization, of course, both on campus and throughout the West Bank, couldn't figure out what to do. So they issued 2 statements. One coming to his defense and one saying that he got what he deserved. He had been identified as a traitor for participating in discussions of Israeli-Palestinian possibilities for peace, discussions with Israelis. Now, the incredible thing about that is that he did so in careful consultation with Yasser Arafat and Arafat's staff, and Arafat had approved him proceeding with those discussions. No matter, the campus was riven by rival political groups with multiple student paramilitary cadres available to impose their competing views by force. Flash forward 1995, Nusseibeh became president of Al-Quds University in East Jerusalem, a position he held until 2014. Throughout those years, when he was university president, he was always accompanied on campus by bodyguards. He continued to teach, and the bodyguards waited outside his classroom. Unfortunately, other Palestinian faculty who are not university presidents don't get to have bodyguards. His narrative, it's compelling because he writes well, but it's far from unique. Such incidents have a long history. In the 1980s, the head of Islamic University's Department of Arabic Language and Literatures, Dr. Ismail al-Khatib, was gunned down by Fatah operatives in front of his house in the presence of his children. In 2005, Fatah gunmen assaulted Islamic University of Gaza President Adnan al-Qadi in his office. As recently as 2014, An-Najah University political scientist and Palestinian Authority opponent Abdul Sattar Qassem was shot in his car, but survived, and he blamed the Palestinian Authority. Other faculty members have been killed or wounded. The chilling effect of deadly assaults on faculty members for their political opinions cannot be overestimated. It doesn't take too many of those before you begin to self-censor. At Islamic University of Gaza, considered the best institution in Gaza, violent clashes between rival student political factions occur frequently, and the campus as a whole is dedicated to the service of the political group Hamas. Faculty members there and in the West Bank and administrators are sometimes threatened and, even as Nusseibeh's case, assaulted. IUG is not just politicized, I mean, that's really a militarized campus. At An-Najah University in the West Bank city of Nablus, Birzeit University, Hamas regularly wins the elections to control the powerful student governments, and they are much more powerful than anything in US or Europe. But conflicts with Hamas's political rival Fatah are commonplace. During the Second Intifada, some students helped organize or participated in suicide bombings and other acts of violences. And I name students and give details of several dozen students involved in suicide bombings during the Second Intifada. And that to me was just a stunning revelation. It was my own not in Kansas anymore recognition that I don't think of students involved in suicide bombings, right? I mean, you're in a different world. And there's a scholar named Matthew Levitt, who's among those who have listed some of the An-Najah students involved, just to give a couple of examples, and there are dozens. Muhammad al-Ghul, who blew himself up on a Jerusalem bus on June 18, 2002, An-Najah student, killing 19 and wounding over 70. Assam Raihan, who attacked a bus near Emmanuel with a roadside bomb and automatic weapons, killing 10 and wounding 30, another An-Najah student. One way or another, the campus environment at An-Najah and other institutions for decades has helped prepare some current students for extreme violent activity. Others leave school to join terrorist cells, and some, in effect, make terrorism their career choice, albeit often for careers cut short by imprisonment or death. It is not just deeply troubling, it's also, I think, definitional that many Palestinian universities have substantial histories of student involvement in terrorism. Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, which in some ways is better than some of the other campuses because of some international faculty who are there, they have a museum on campus dedicated to celebrating terrorism. So those perpetrators who were killed continue to the present day, the student perpetrators who were killed, to be celebrated on campus as martyrs. When suicide bombings began to fade as a strategy, the Intifada ended, Israel erected the security barrier, Hamas shifted tactics to conventional bombings and began to organize student terror cells trained to build explosives to be set off in public places. Such terror cells are still operating. I tracked them up through the middle of 2020. In March 2020, the Shin Bet security services arrested 3 Hamas members who were planning attacks at Teddy Soccer Stadium in Jerusalem and on IDF soldiers near Ramallah, though the stadium was too well guarded. The 3 men had met while studying at Birzeit. They were members of a student fraternity that's a center of Hamas activity. Israeli security services identify, track, and arrest members of these student cells. Some have been caught with assembled explosives in hand. But it's only going to take one successful terrorist attack by students to dramatically change relations between Israelis and Palestinians. So in addition to maintaining bomb-making squads, both Hamas and Fatah train student groups to enforce their versions of political and religious conformity on campus. They deliver selective beatings to other students as intimidation tactics. The rival groups, along with Islamic Jihad, openly recruit new members from each entering class of freshmen. They hand out printed color brochures promoting their particular group. The brochures celebrate martyrs, student martyrs who've died during the cause, and so forth. Neither faculty members nor students feel free to express unpopular political opinions as a result. A climate of fear regarding religion and politics. To echo back to my earlier today, there's no climate of fear regarding accounting procedures. So if you just think about accounting procedures, you think, gee, these places are okay. It's over religion and politics that the climate of fear prevails. Now, despite the accusations regularly advanced by the BDS movement and its allies, Israelis are not the source of that climate of fear. It's the Palestinians themselves who've made ideological conformity a hallmark of their campuses. Israel has made poor decisions, no question about that. Most notably today, staging raids on Palestinian campuses that accomplish little, in particular because most student terror cells are organized off the campus. And in fact, most raids occur off campus, not on campus. At Islamic University of Gaza, where I think the impact on the curriculum is greater than anywhere else, the entire curriculum is required to be taught from an Islamist, not Islamic, Islamist perspective.
Thanks,
Back to you,
Cary.
Miriam.
I mean, that's just like a little bit of what's in Nika that, Cary is describing, where there's just unbelievable repression, suppression, the chilling of speech, and political opinion. And it really isn't an Israeli project, and it's a Palestinian project, and one that, as we'll get into in a minute, the anti-Israel movement simply ignores, maybe knows about, but doesn't want anybody else to know about. but Cary really exposes all of it. So that's where I want to go now. Sort of what are the and who are the main audiences for Not in Kansas Anymore? What do you hope they'll learn from the project?
Yeah, well, just briefly, I mean, the first audience is students, faculty, administrators who support Israel, but have little or no information about Palestinian higher education. And by the way, I only found one Israeli faculty member who studies Palestinian higher education. So repeatedly, I was told we don't know any of this stuff, and it isn't because Ramallah is so very far away from Tel Aviv. So I want to give people the facts they need to know and the contextualization for them. And I also obviously hope to reach faculty, students, administrators, policymakers who have an open mind about these issues. I have no fantasy that I can reach hardcore BDS supporters. It's easiest if you think of them as like true QAnon believers. If they've embraced the anti-Israel conspiracy theories, they're not going to be reached. If they say Israel is the worst human rights violator in the world, don't expect to have a useful discussion. If they say, if only Israel could be destroyed, working people across the world would be freed, don't expect to have a useful chat. But I think still it's important to give allies the information that they need.
Right. Absolutely. So one thing that you include quite a bit in the research paper, and then in the citations as well, are all the interviews that you did with faculty on these Palestinian campuses. So we thought it might be interesting if you were to share one of the most memorable interviews that you did while compiling the research.
Yeah, I think the one that was particularly transformative for me took place. I spent a full day in Jerusalem, in a Jerusalem cafe, actually drinking a lot of coffee with Mohammed Dajani. Um, he had taught at Al-Quds University in East Jerusalem, where he took a group of his Palestinian students to visit Auschwitz, a really very poignant and memorable thing to do. It was very widely publicized, and as a result, he was attacked in the Palestinian press as the world's worst normalizer and warned not to return to campus. But he came back anyway, and shortly thereafter, his car was incinerated in the front of his apartment. It burst into flame and was destroyed. That was reported, but during our conversation, he told me that contrary to press reports, the attack on the car was actually an assassination attempt. A flammable fluid was poured into all the gaps in the car, and it was designed to burst into flame when the car engine heated up. But an unusually hot day intervened, and so it burst into flame sitting on the street in front of his apartment. I think that was the point when I realized we weren't in Kansas anymore. It wasn't quite the same as, someone submitting a grade complaint, trying to have you killed.
That story is just unreal. And I had a chance to meet Mohammed Dajani as well, and he shared some of that when he came. We invited him out to speak at Syracuse. And we say all the time, like, there are risks involved to speaking out, right? And to doing our work on campus, and to advancing AAN's mission, that there are professional costs, there are professional risks, and but not yet are we worried about a targeted assassination attempt or having our car blown up, or it's just a whole nother level, a whole nother plane.
Let alone for taking students to Auschwitz.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean,
To be doing
not exactly speaking out in the
right, to be
conventional
doing
sense.
coexistence work, to be doing work that involves pursuit of peace and justice, and then to face those kinds of outcomes. So Cary, can you say a bit more about your disciplinary training? Because I think that does come through quite a bit in a lot of the work that you do in combating Israel delegitimization and campus anti-Semitism. Your training in literary criticism in the liberal arts. I mean, it really does come through in your work, and I think it comes through in this research paper as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that informed the way you went about this study?
Sure. First of all, I think, you get or should get a certain amount of training in humane values in the humanities, or at least I used to think that was true. But there is something specific to English, which is close reading techniques. And many other people have used those close reading techniques in analyzing political texts. For me, more than anything else, I deployed them in reading poetry, and now I'm reading other kinds of things, although poetry as well. Um, yeah, I mentioned that at Islamic University of Gaza, they require all classes to be taught from an Islamist perspective. I have no idea how you would teach a class in theoretical physics from an Islamist perspective. I mean, other than celebrating the historic scientific accomplishments in Islam, but how you would teach the theory itself, I don't know. But there's a 2009 book, The Political Ideology of Hamas, by Michael Irving Jensen of the Danish Institute for International Studies, who audited some IUG classes and talks about a class session in an American literature course about Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1850 novel, The Scarlet Letter. Islam and Sharia law, the instructor explained, are much more ethical and humane than the legal system in the West. And he asks the student how the novel shows that's the case, and they don't know. They don't have an answer. So he has to provide it. And he says, well, in the West, an adulteress faces a life of shame and has to wear a scarlet A for the rest of her days. Here, we're much more humane. We stone an adulteress to death. Um, Jensen also talks about class discussion of British poet Roger McGough's children's poem, The Cats Protection League, from his 1997 book, Bad, Bad Cats. A British writer who's done about a dozen children's books, as well as lots of poetry for adults. Now, the first thing that's weird is the instructor teaches the poem, but he doesn't tell the students in Gaza who wrote it, where it came from, or anything about it. It's just a text, right? Unmoored to anything. Now, I've read McGough's collected poems, and there really isn't a single poem about the Middle East. So I'll take a moment of personal privilege and read the short poem, The Cats Protection League, for you. Midnight, a knock at the door. Open it? Better had. 3 heavy cats, mean and bad. They offer protection. I ask, what for? The boss cat snarls, you know the score. Listen, man, and listen good. If you want to stay in this neighborhood, pay your dues or the toms will call and wail each night from the backyard wall. Mangle the flowers. And as for the lawn, a smelly minefield awaits you at dawn. These guys meant business without doubt. 3 cans of tuna, I handed them out. Then they disappeared like bats in hell. Those bad, bad cats from CPL, the Cats Protection League. So the instructor starts off by confirming that the language in the poem is colloquial. And he says, yes, it's dialect, everyday language, even though it's not in a friendly tone. It reminds us of American gangs. Student, Jewish gangs. Professor, yes, just like during the Intifada. Student, Jewish as usual. Student, it reminds me of Fagin and Oliver Twist. Student, I take a similar view. The cats symbolize the Jewish lobby in the States, and the man is an image of the United States. So the contortions that they have to go through to read this rather innocent poem through an anti-Semitic lens are really quite remarkable. It still astonishes me after reading it, rereading it for years. But it's clear what the instructor wants from his students. Their responses give him what he wants, but they've been well trained to provide it. IUG has actually a 5-year curriculum for its degree, and the first year is an organized curriculum called Islamicum, a mandatory program that trains students in what amounts to anti-Semitic interpretation. So we're sort of faced with classrooms that in some ways amount to hate groups. Just to quickly switch to the West Bank and take an example from Birzeit University, it has an Israel studies program. It declares that its mission is, quote, to strengthen critical awareness of power, hegemony, and the moral philosophical aspects of knowledge production in confronting occupation, settler colonialism, and violence, end quote. But a faculty member in the program who was interviewed is more explicit, quote, my basic strategy is to show them that all of the atrocities of Zionism and the occupation are basically comparable atrocities. So I've had some use from my literary training in actually dealing with poetic interpretation in these surprising contexts.
Well, thank you for that reading. And I bet people came on the call didn't know you'd have a poetry reading for an AAN webinar, but we do a lot of things in our organization. So thank you for that. You're a man of many talents, Cary. So that was great. I want to ask about the challenges of doing this work and getting the information and the evidence to make your claims not in Kansas anymore and in doing this research. Can you tell us just a bit about that as we start to wrap up and open it up?
So mostly I had to be relentless. First of all, just searches. I had to keep trying different searches in popular like Google and also academic search engines. There are no search terms that will cover the territory or gather all the information. You just have to be relentless in trying different combinations, following up references and other publications and so forth. And you can only stop when you just can't find out anything more. I stopped when weeks went by, I couldn't get anything else. There is, however, an interesting feature of Gazan and West Bank news reporting, which is that Fatah and Hamas-affiliated reporters will document violence and destructive practices by their opponents. Fatah will indict Hamas, Hamas will indict Fatah, but they won't say anything about their own allies. But once you get claims from one reporter, you get names attached to them, you can follow those up and confirm other sources. Interviews, given my history and given the fact that Zionists aren't really welcome in Palestinian universities, one of the things I did was I always spend a couple of weeks in the American University in East Jerusalem. And that hotel, it's run by Palestinians, and Palestinian faculty administrators will come there to talk with me. It has beautiful gardens, sit there, give them something to drink, and they'll sit and we can sit and talk for hours if necessary. And so that was one of the practical things to do to actually get access to faculty.
That's the American Colony Hotel, right?
Yeah, the American Colony Hotel, right.
Yeah, yeah.
Not cheap, but incredibly beautiful.
It is. It is.
But I justified it because it was a research.
It was for research. Not on the AAN expense account though. So
I'm afraid not.
so You do talk quite a bit about the differences between the humanities and the STEM fields, the hard sciences. And one of our last questions is, what about exchanges between STEM faculty in Palestinian universities and STEM faculty, whether it's Israeli Arab students or Palestinian faculty in Israeli campuses? Do they have the same kind of restrictions? Can they do scholarly and educational exchanges? And how do we encourage that? Like, is that a first step to encouraging more engagement between the two, academic? I mean, they're so close physically and geographically, and yet it seems like this great divide.
Well, it would be great, but there's only one field with a history of Palestinian students willing to work with Israelis, and that's medicine. And I think that's partly out of necessity. There really is no choice to get some training in Israel. It dates to the 1980s and really to 1984, and that a lot of that collaboration continues today. That's Palestinians coming over and studying in Israel. It doesn't mean Israelis safely going to the West Bank to study there. That's just not realistic. You can read about the medical collaboration in my book Israel Denial, where I devote a lot of space to it because it's really a great thing. Otherwise, the increase in anti-normalization ideology has made exchanges impossible. Look, there have been offers to Palestinian students and faculty to use libraries in Israel because the libraries in Palestinian universities, they have a good representative selection of texts, even ideologically representative, but they're just not big libraries. And basically, people won't do it. They won't use the Israeli libraries because it's considered a form of normalization. You add to that universities like Birzeit that explicitly bar Zionists from campus. I mean, those exchanges at this point just aren't going to happen. I wish they would, but it's the problem, is on the other side of the green line.
Yeah. So before we open it up, just the last question is, what can AEN members do? How can they use Not in Kansas Anymore in order to advance our goals and mission on the campus? And do you have any final words before we open it up to Q&A and comments?
Sure. Well, I think it's good for AEN members to have this information. That is for AEN members to be reasonably knowledgeable about what Palestinian higher education is, because the BDS movement makes claims about it all the time. And they make claims that it's Israel that suppresses academic freedom. And I think the evidence for that doesn't exist, whereas there's massive evidence that Palestinians themselves suppress academic freedom, in part because of their political differences and in part because the Palestinian Authority is not respectful either of academic freedom or of press freedom. So I think in campus and community discussions, at professional association meetings, when academic boycott resolutions are discussed and voted on, and claims about the suppression of academic freedom are made, you folks should be able to answer it with facts, right? Again, the QAnon committed folks amongst BDS allies are not going to listen. But a lot of people in those rooms that aren't committed one way or another will listen, I think. And, in terms of what's not known, the first clearly is that this kind of information contradicts the left orthodoxy that dominates humanities and social science disciplines in Western democracies. Palestinians are exclusively seen as victims, not agents with a hand in their own destiny. And so therefore they can't be responsible for suppressing academic freedom. because they're just victims. So how could they do it? How can a victim do that, right? Well, you can be a victim and you can be someone with agency. You can be both at different hours of the day. I think faculty members also fear reputational damage and social ostracization that can quickly follow upon breaching this orthodoxy and speaking frankly against those orthodoxies. But if you're an AEN member, you're supposed to, discover the background and backbone and do it, as indeed I think most of our members do. Of course, the two things are mutually reinforcing. This project tells a disturbing story, but I think it needs to be told. Whatever the odds are against the reform of Palestinian universities, the odds aren't improved by ignorance and misinformation.
Well,
So, questions,
yes, thank you
comments?
so much, Cary. We do have a number of questions in the chat, and we'll also save the chat so that if people have to leave at 1, you'll still get their questions, and we'll be able to send them to you. You can have a dialogue with our members. But I think first up,
And people should also feel free to email me with questions.
yeah,
I
right.
try to respond.
Thank you so much. I think Dan Gordon, if you're still on, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
So what I wrote was the following, Cary. For those of us with a special interest in your intellectual development, what's the relation between this kind of work focusing on failure of foreign universities in your previous work as a Marxist, leftist cultural studies guru, self-styled tenured radical, critiquing American universities for colluding with racism, with the war on terror, and so forth? Is it basically a question of degree that the problems in Palestinian universities are simply much worse than in ours, or has a change taken place in your self-conception as a leftist academic or as an academic per se? And I wrote the question before you made the reference to the leftist orthodoxy. But I think it suggests that the question may well have a point.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that occasionally either keeps me up at night or wakes me up early in the morning. I still think of myself as being on the left, but I think that political analysis is often limited in its efficacy by the kinds of established spaces that exist. So, in Israel denial and elsewhere in many different places, I make very specific arguments about how to promote a two-state solution. And these are consistently left arguments. They're backed up by a lot of detail and a lot of analysis and a lot of thinking. So I'm on the left when I write those things. But there are no spaces in the world, maybe other than Fathom, the British journal, where you can combine progressive left thought about building a two-state solution and also criticizing BDS and anti-Zionism for its failures and its anti-Semitism. Most of that, the latter, is considered a kind of right-wing activity. I think identifying unproductive tendencies on the left and destructive tendencies on the left is part of good progressive politics. But there aren't a lot of places in the world that will bridge those two activities. So I think, I'm confronted by the fact that many of my former friends on the left, and I say former, I've not broken with anyone over politics, but a lot of them have sure broken with me. Many of them have signed BDS petitions. I had close friendships with a lot of people who now support BDS, and they mostly won't talk to me anymore. I'm always willing to talk, but they won't. So I don't see myself as having undergone a personal transformation to embrace these two activities in dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I'm not sure how many people in the world would agree with me. So I think a lot of people feel I've left the left behind. So be it. I'll persist in my delusions at least as long as I last. Israel Denial has a chapter on teaching Israeli and Palestinian poetry together. And mostly I deal with political poetry. And there's, both groups write love poetry, and they write poetry about, the beautiful sunset and wherever else. And I'm mostly not interested in either Israeli or Palestinian poetry of that sort. I'm dealing with how both deal with politics. And I am sympathetic to both groups of poems that criticize the occupation, that talk about the suffering that takes place on both sides of the Green Line. Once again, the fact that I can write sympathetically about anti-Zionist Palestinian poetry means that I'm not following the standard divisions that structure political debate. One of the Palestinian poets I write about and admire, Mahmoud Darwish, is of course castigated in a lot of more conservative media, more conservative pro-Zionist media. So I try to find ways of bridging that difference, and at least in my own head, thinking of my own commitments holistically, but it's tricky. In any case, I do not believe myself to be suffering either from a character change, a political transformation, or a brain tumor. I think of these as mutually reinforcing commitments. But I also think I should write something about this.
I think you should write it. I think you should write it up because it's important. And also just for your position, right? Because I think it sometimes gets misconstrued or mislabeled, or so I think that would be really helpful.
I mean, back in the day when I would go to New York, I always stayed in Andrew Ross's apartment, played with his kids.
I doubt that happens these days.
I mean, not anymore.
No,
he's of course the leader of the BDS movement on the NYU faculty.
We're revising our guidebook that all AN members will get in the spring, and one of the sections I was writing on is the impact of this conflict on interpersonal relationships and what that really means when you lose friends and colleagues and over this. So it's important.
Yeah, of course I'm still on. How could I leave? This is great. In my experience, students are interested in other students. What kind of fraternities do they have in the territories? And so I sort of put in facetiously, do they have fraternities like Iota Gamma Epsilon, standing for I'm going to explode, or Beta Mu Upsilon, blow me up? What have we seen in these, you call them almost hate groups? Do they have things that their students have to do, like hazing, to join? They have to do something against an Israeli, perform some anti-Semitic or anti-Israel act. Is that what they're doing, like joining gangs in the United States? You have to go out and mug somebody. Has that happened, or do I not even want to raise that question anywhere?
Well, I mean, it's possible there are things I don't know, right? I mean, I basically know what people tell me and what I can find out by reading. What I do know is that fraternities in the West Bank and Gaza tend to have a political identification. That is, a fraternity is going to be identified with Fatah, or it's going to be identified with Hamas, and that a certain amount of organizing will take place among the students in that fraternity. But typically, off campus. That is, they don't want to plan violence on campus itself, but they work together sometimes off campus. I know no examples of hazing where violent initiations occur. I've never heard of that. It's a great question. Um,
I
I
just
don't,
don't want it to be a great idea. So
I
let me
mean,
write it down here.
I almost don't know who to pose the question to because there are
Don't.
so few experts on the subject, but I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. In any case, fraternities are politically identified, and they're identified with one political faction or another. That's a strong feature in the Palestinian universities.
Well,
Thank you.
we're going to hang on a little bit longer. I know that there are, people have to go at 1. Thank you so much for joining, as I know people do have other commitments, but if you can stay on, Cary, we'll stay on, and we'll stay on with some people that did have.
I've never cut a Q&A short any time in my life.
Right. If we
It
were in
goes on for,
person,
if it goes on for 3 or 4 hours, I'm going to be there.
if we were in person, we'd go out for drinks and just continue the conversation for the rest of the afternoon. But
Preferably one of Rafa's restaurant suggestions. That would be
right.
good.
That's right. That's right. Well, we'll just have to wait a little while longer. I know there are some questions in the queue from people I think that had to leave, so we'll be sure to get you those questions. But I do see Ellen on my screen, and it's a great question, Ellen. It brings us back to our own engagement with some of these scholars. So Ellen, if you want to unmute and just and ask your question, that would be great.
Thank you. Yeah, it's about credentialing. Who are the people who teach? And it comes from a specific instance. I was in Kyoto. I was invited as speaker at a UN conference. Another invited speaker was a professor, supposedly from Gaza Islamic University. The utter ignorance, it was appalling. He was a PhD or the equivalent. He had a self-published book, but that wouldn't bother me. It was what he said. He referred to Israel, which he refused to name, as the Jewish, and then talked extensively about the Jewish as our political influence worldwide, especially in the US. But there was a whole panel on Darfur, and I had students who'd gone to Darfur. I'd been very involved in research. I have a colleague who had been deeply involved. His appalling ignorance and refusal to engage with any discussion. There was no Arab involvement, which isn't true. But aside from that, the panelists were graduate students and professors from Doshi Shah University. There was no interest in engaging whatsoever. There's only one cabal. It was the Jewish cabal. And what bothered me was not so much what I heard, because I'd heard that from others, but that this is a professor at Islamic University. Who are these people? I'm sorry, I get upset, but I'm serious. I was speechless at that level of ignorance. What? Who's teaching?
Well, it's really, first of all, it's only in the current generation that a significant number of faculty members at Palestinian universities have PhDs. Many of them just had master's degrees, and master's degrees, of course, you can get on site. In fields that are ideologically dominated, I don't know how much use a master's degree is going to be in teaching from with an open mind and from an academic freedom perspective. There are now, of course, quite a lot of faculty members in Palestinian universities who got their PhDs abroad, because that's where they have to get them. Mm-hmm. I think the problem comes not with the kind of training they've had as PhDs, but with the ideological conformity that's enforced once they get on campus. Now, in the right small classroom that can develop an atmosphere of trust, and where you feel you don't have any informants among the students, I think you can get a reasonably open degree of discussion. But anti-Zionism is going to prevail basically in any classroom in a Palestinian university. Again, not necessarily in accounting, but when anti-Zionism is relevant to the subject matter, then it's going to dominate the discussion, and you're not really going to get much in the way of open exchange. I also think you're looking at programmatic requirements that force quite a bit of conformity on student work. So I read to you that statement of purpose from the Israel Studies program at Birzeit. So do you think a student could decide to write a term paper sympathetic to Zionism and get away with it within that program? I think not. So, humanities and social science programs define themselves in such a way that pretty much biases student self-expression as well. You're going to teach that way for 10 years, you're going to sound that way. You're not going to come to an international conference and suddenly show a different, intellectual color. So these tend to be kind of self-reinforcing enterprises, unfortunately.
I just one follow-up, if I may, is because Al-Quds, sorry, Nusayba, seems like a higher level of intellectual rigor than what I encountered there. Is there a difference between Gaza and Al-Quds, for example?
Well, I mean, Al-Quds has had a long time relationship with Bard.
Right.
And so they do have some Bard faculty teaching there, who I think despite the student support for terrorism, and despite the very omnipresent anti-Zionism on the campus, there are faculty members at Al-Quds who are open-minded. They're from the West. They're not beholden in the same way to the Palestinian Authority. They are, so they do have some better people there, but not everybody, that's for sure. And there is very intense Fatah or Hamas student organizing amongst the Al-Quds student body on campus. So you're still in a pretty coercive political environment, but there are flashes of something better. It's, a small classroom with the right instructor can be different.
Thank you.
I think that's really important to note. So that there are, quantitative, qualitative differences between a university in Gaza, Islamic University, and a place like Al-Quds, or even Al-Quds versus Birzeit and An-Najah, and so that is important.
I try to take up in the book the issue of whether, in the research report, and the issue of what kind of relationships other universities should establish with
Right.
Palestinian universities. And what I basically say is that I think student exchanges are a good thing. Faculty exchanges, if possible, if it's safe, and that's not always safe, are a good thing. But I have a lot of problem with just blind financial support for Palestinian universities, just giving them grants, just giving them support without really understanding what that money goes for. And both the European Union and some other institutions here and elsewhere, feel it's a good thing to support them because they're universities. Well, my argument is it don't mean the same thing as it does in Kansas.
So I do know we're getting comments in the chat thanking you, Cary, for your time and for doing this research. And I know some people need to go. We're going to hang on for a few more minutes because there are some people who are telling me I'm still on and can I get my question in? So
As I said, I never sign off.
I know that. Cary, we asked you for a 5,000 word paper. I mean, come on, right? But it was worth it.
Well, it's still with a 5. It's 50 instead of 5 comma. 50,000 rather than 5,000. What's the difference?
So, Mark, I see you are on, and you have a really good question about the relationship between the present and the past. So, if you want to unmute yourself, you can.
Yes, thank you, Cary, for the talk. I was curious about the historical perspective when you speak about physics from an Islamic perspective. I immediately thought of physics from a Marxist perspective, which is a well-known precedent. And when you discuss of terrorists coming out of universities, I could think immediately of Western Europe in the 70s and going back to Nazi universities or to Nazis in universities in the 30s. Have you looked at this, have this broader context for your study of Palestinian universities?
That's a really great question. I sure wish you'd asked me that a year ago, in which case I would really have had to have thought about it. But I think there are examples, obviously, in modern German history of students getting involved in terrorist activity. And I really haven't tried to make those comparisons. I don't know the cultural contexts in any comparable way, but I think that really merits being thought about. And it raises a myriad of questions, not only about the effects of political indoctrination and political commitment on campus and what decisions people make in the real world outside it, but also when comparing the different kind of cultural contexts. The Palestinian universities, at least on the West Bank, there are no student suicide bombers now. There's been this shift in Hamas tactics, Islamic Jihad tactics, to bombings where you can get away. You set the bomb with a timer, you set the bomb off with a remote control, and you don't get killed yourself. Those bombings have been unsuccessful so far, although there's been an attempt, certainly many attempts to do that. And I can't answer what the relationship might be between that change in tactics and the kinds of political discussion and indoctrination that go on campus. And that kind of comparison and contrast could be made with other countries as well, right? Students that get involved directly in violence, students who, are marginally associated with it. Suicide bombings require a remarkably diverse range of commitments. It's not just the person who wears a bomb and sets it off. It's the people who buy the materials to create the bomb. It's the people who learn how to build it. It's the people who scout out the terrain. It's the people who oversee and then escape. There's just a whole range of different kinds of terrorist affiliated commitments that are involved. And I think in Europe, some of that same range is going to have applied, also worthy of study. So I think it's a great issue. I'm not prepared to speak to it with any expertise, but I really like the challenge. I appreciate the challenge.
Thank you.
Right. Well, I think we're going to end with one more question, which I think is a good way to segue to our closing of this webinar and everything you've shared with us, Cary. So this is Joseph, who asks, what does your research tell us about the willingness of Palestinian society in general to make peace with Israel? And Joseph, you can unmute if you like, if you want to add to that or.
Thank you, Miriam. Yeah, I'm wondering, are these universities representative of Palestinian society? Are they more radical than the mainstream of Palestinian society? Are they less radical? Are they about the same?
Well, one of the conclusions that I reach is that the political atmosphere in these institutions is so coercive that I think this is this is the single worst conclusion from the project, which is that Palestinian students and faculty and the institutions that they belong to are not going to be the source of positive developments or contributions toward the peace process. I mean, I'm not saying they're the worst elements in Palestinian society, but there aren't going to be any student faculty peace groups in these institutions. They are, so you know, they're at the radical end of the spectrum. Not necessarily, again, the accounting professors, but the kind of total atmosphere of the campus is going to prevent, I think, any sources. Now, you know, just to give you one counter example, there's an Israeli NGO that has been operating for about half a dozen years, maybe a little more than that, and it trains Palestinians and Israelis, young Palestinian and Israeli professionals, in peace negotiations. They take 15 of each in a given year. I've met with the group. You meet with them on condition that you never give their name, and I'm good at not breaking confidences, because they can't take the risk that the Palestinian participants would be killed because they're normalizing relations with Israel. So they train them for a year in conducting peace negotiations. The logic is that if peace negotiations ever become a real possibility, they want some young Palestinian professionals who are not politicians and some Israeli professionals who are not politicians to be well trained. The program includes a trip to Northern Ireland during the course of the year and meeting with people there, and it ends with a weekend on in the dead of winter on a frigid island off the coast of Sweden, and the only building on the island is the building that this group uses. For a week, they conduct Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. The Palestinian trainees do the Israeli negotiations, and the Israelis negotiate for the Palestinian side. And that's central to how you learn to do negotiating. You really understand the other side from the inside out. So there are elements within Palestinian society that have a deep devotion to the peace process. I'm sorry, the universities just aren't. And that's, you know, I think that's really the most depressing thing about this whole story. And maybe the worst, not in Kansas anymore, difference than that there isn't a student peace group component on these campuses. And the faculty members, whatever they do feel, don't dare take those kinds of positions. If they do, they put themselves at risk.
Thank you, Cary. It is depressing, but yet they're off campus. There's more going on, and we have to, know that too, and support where we can. But the on-campus situation and what you described in Nika is just shocking. I mean, I knew some of it, but I did not know all of this, and so we're really eager to get this to your hands so that you can read this and use this information to help educate others about what's happening, so that hopefully we can get some traction and there can be some support for campus-free expression and academic freedom, at least on some of the campuses where we might have access. One comment at the end was, thank you all, this was great, can't wait to get Cary's book. And I think that's, first of all, it's a research paper. It's an inaugural research paper in AN's research paper series, actually says research paper #1. But it is a book. It's hardbound and soft copy, and it's on Amazon. Academic Studies Press is also distributing it, and we're really proud of it. And we thank you, Cary, for your time and your commitment to our work, and for all that you do, and for giving us your time today.
And thank you for months and months of support for the project. You've been consistent and great.
Thank you as well. Mutual.